In the early 1940s, as the Second World War tore across continents, armies everywhere were learning the same brutal lesson. Speed was survival. Tanks could crush almost anything on land, but they couldn't get to the battlefield fast enough. Every river, mountain, and swamp became a trap. Every delay, a death sentence. The Soviet Union faced an especially terrible problem. When German forces invaded in 1941, they advanced faster than anyone thought possible. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was not just tanks and planes. It was movement, constant and unstoppable. Entire Soviet units were surrounded before they could even retreat. Supplies couldn't reach the front, and heavy armour, the pride of Soviet power, was often left behind, mired in mud or destroyed before it ever saw combat. So Soviet engineers began asking a strange question. What if tanks could fly? It sounded ridiculous. Tanks were made of steel, not dreams. They weighed tons. They were slow, loud, and heavy. The very idea of lifting one into the air seemed insane, a fantasy better left to pulp magazines. But in wartime, desperation breeds invention. And one man, a young engineer named Oleg Antonov, refused to laugh. Antonov was only in his mid-30s, but already a prodigy in Soviet aviation. Born in 1906, he'd spent his youth sketching airplanes on scraps of paper, fascinated by flight. By the time the war began, he was working under the legendary Andrei Tupolev and had already designed several successful gliders for the Red Army. To Antonov, flight wasn't just an engineering challenge. It was a way to solve the impossible. When the idea of an airborne tank reached his desk in 1941, he didn't dismiss it. He studied it. He imagined a future where armoured divisions could glide silently behind enemy lines, landing with tanks ready to fire within minutes. If a tank could fly, it could change everything. No more waiting for bridges, no more dragging armour across swamps or mountain passes. A single aircraft could deliver a tank directly into battle. To most people, it was madness. To Antonov, it was math. The Red Army's high command gave him cautious approval. After all, the Soviets had already experimented with strange hybrid vehicles, motorized sleds, flying submarines, even rocket-powered interceptors. If anyone could make a flying tank real, it was Antonov. He began drafting plans for what would become the Antonov A40 KT, also known simply as the flying tank. The concept was elegant in its insanity. Take a light tank, the T-60, and attach a massive pair of detachable biplane wings, plus a twin-boom tail. It wouldn't truly fly on its own, but rather glide, towed into the air by a heavy bomber like the TB-3. Once released, it would soar toward its destination, land on its treads, detach the wings, and roll straight into combat. A tank that didn't just arrive, but descended from the sky. The idea spread quietly through Soviet design circles, half in admiration, half in disbelief. Some saw it as genius, others as a suicide mission. The weight of the armour, the drag of the wings, the power of the tow plane. Every variable was a nightmare. But Antonov's confidence never wavered. He believed that in war the line between brilliant and insane was often only drawn by success. By 1942, his workshop in Moscow had been relocated to Siberia to escape German bombing. There, under freezing conditions and constant shortages, Antonov and his small team began building a prototype. They scavenged aluminum from scrap, fabric from damaged aircraft, and even parts from gliders designed for paratroopers. Piece by piece, the flying tank began to take shape, a Frankenstein machine of wings and armour, hope and desperation. And as it neared completion, the Soviet Air Force prepared for what would become one of the strangest test flights in the history of aviation. By early 1942, Antonov's workshop in Siberia was little more than a drafty hangar surrounded by snow. Power flickered. Supplies ran out. Workers slept beside the machines they were building. Yet in that bleak corner of wartime Russia, something utterly unique was taking shape. A tank with wings. The official designation was the Antonov A40 KT, short for Krylia Tanka, tank wings. On paper, it sounded deceptively simple. Take a T-60 light tank, remove unnecessary armour to reduce weight, attach enormous wooden biplane wings and a double tail, and tow it behind a bomber. In practice, every step was an engineering nightmare. A machine that shouldn't exist. The T-60 tank itself weighed nearly 6 tons, far more than any glider had ever carried. Even stripped of ammunition, armor plating, and fuel, it was still absurdly heavy. Antonov's engineers had to calculate everything down to the last bolt. How much lift the wings could generate, how much drag the tank's blunt shape would create, how strong the connections between the wings and the hull would have to be to survive turbulence. It wasn't just about flight, it was about survival. One error, one crack in the structure, and the entire machine would shatter in mid-air. Still, Antonov pressed forward. He used lightweight pine for the wing frames, covered them in canvas, and bolted them to reinforced mounts welded directly onto the tank's body. A rudder and elevator were attached at the back via twin booms, giving the tank the silhouette of a bizarre flying insect. Engineers who saw it for the first time didn't know whether to salute or laugh. It looked both majestic and absurd, a tank seemingly sprouting wings in defiance of logic, the generals and the doubters. When Antonov first presented his prototype to the Soviet Air Force, the room was divided. Some generals were intrigued, others were furious. "Comrade Antonov," one colonel reportedly said, "tanks belong on the ground. If they are in the sky, something has gone wrong." But others, especially those at the front, understood the appeal. The war was raging across impossible terrain, forests, rivers, and frozen tundra where tanks often arrived too late. If Antonov's idea worked, armoured divisions could appear behind enemy lines in hours, not days. In theory, a formation of glider tanks could land near bridges, railways, or supply depots, cutting German forces off from behind. It was the stuff of military fantasy, and in Stalin's USSR, fantasies that promised victory were worth pursuing. Antonov received approval to test his design, preparing for flight. There was just one problem. No Soviet aircraft was powerful enough to tow a 6-ton tank. The best option available was the massive Tupolev TB-3 bomber, a lumbering giant with 4 engines. But even it struggled to lift the tank and its glider frame. Still, the plan moved forward. A single T-60 tank was modified, turret removed, armour shaved down, everything stripped to the bare minimum. Inside, the pilot was not a soldier, but a brave volunteer, Sergeant Major Sergei Anokhin, one of the USSR's most skilled test glider pilots. He wasn't told much about the risks, but he didn't need to be. Looking at the steel monster with its canvas wings, he knew the odds of survival were slim. A leap of faith. On a grey morning in September 1942, engineers rolled the flying tank onto a frozen runway near Moscow. The bomber was already in position, its engines growling in the cold air. A thick steel cable linked the TB-3 to Antonov's creation, 6 tons of armour ready to take flight. Ground crews stepped back. Antonov himself watched from a snowbank, clutching his hat against the wind. Years of work, ridicule, and hope had come down to this one moment. The engines roared. The bomber lurched forward, dragging the tank across the snow. The glider's massive wings began to flex, fabric rippling under the strain. Slowly, impossibly, the tank began to lift. For the first time in history, a tank left the ground. But the flight was far from over, and what happened next would decide whether Antonov's dream would soar or crash back to Earth. As the massive TB-3 bomber clawed through the sky, its engines strained against the impossible weight behind it. The steel cables trembled. The flying tank, Antonov's hybrid of war and wonder, wobbled violently as it lifted higher. Inside the cockpit, Sergeant Major Sergei Anokhin gripped the controls, every muscle tense. The wind tore at the glider's fabric wings. The instruments shook so hard he could barely read them. He could feel every vibration of the tank's steel body fighting against the air. It wasn't built to fly, and it knew it. Below him, the forests of Moscow Oblast rolled past like a grey-green blur. Above him, the bomber's engines howled. And somewhere on the ground, Oleg Antonov held his breath. This was it. Years of ridicule, hundreds of hours of design, thousands of calculations, all hanging by a few bolts, a few cables, and the courage of one man. The struggle in the sky. At first, the flight seemed almost stable. The glider climbed slowly to around 200 meters, then 300. But the strain on the TB-3 grew unbearable. Its engines began to overheat. The cable stretched and groaned as if about to snap. Anokhin could see the bomber above him pitching upward, fighting to stay airborne. Then, suddenly, The tow line went slack. The flying tank had broken free. For a split second, silence filled the cockpit. The rumble of engines was gone. The bomber was already veering away, limping toward base. Now it was just Anokin, alone, inside a 6-ton steel glider falling through the cold autumn air. A controlled crash. He didn't panic. Years of test flights had taught him that fear killed faster than gravity. He fought the stick with all his strength. The controls were heavy, sluggish. Every small adjustment took seconds to respond. But slowly he levelled the descent. Fields and forests stretched out below him. He spotted a clearing, small, uneven, but flat enough to try. The tank's steel tracks were locked. The wings creaked under pressure. At 150 metres he deployed the flaps. At 100 the nose tilted up. At 50 the ground came rushing up like a wall. Then impact. The tank slammed into the earth, bounced once, skidded across the frozen field and came to a stop in a cloud of dirt and broken canvas. The wings tore off, the tail snapped, but the tank and its pilot survived. When the engineers reached the crash site, they found Anokin standing beside the wreckage smoking a cigarette. He simply said, "Comrade Antonov, it flies." The aftermath. The experiment proved that the concept, insane as it seemed, was possible. A tank could fly, but possible wasn't enough. The test had nearly destroyed both aircraft. The TB-3 bomber had barely managed to return to base, his engines close to failure. To make the idea practical, the Soviets would need a far more powerful towplane, something that didn't exist in 1942. And with the war intensifying, every resource was redirected to more urgent needs. Real tanks, real bombers, real weapons. Antonov's project was quietly shelved. The prototype was dismantled for parts, and the flying tank, the world's first and only, became a footnote in the history of war. Legacy of a dreamer. For Antonov, the experiment wasn't a failure. It was a lesson, one that shaped the rest of his career. He went on to design some of the Soviet Union's greatest transport aircraft, including the legendary An-2 biplane, and later the massive An-124 Ruslan, one of the largest cargo planes ever built. Every time those colossal machines took off, they carried a little piece of the flying tank with them, the dream that even the impossible could fly. As for Sergei Anokin, he became a test pilot legend, flying experimental aircraft until the 1950s. When asked years later about the day he flew a tank, he smiled and said, "It was heavy. It didn't glide well, but it was the proudest landing I ever made." For decades, the story of Antonov's flying tank was little more than a rumour, a half-remembered whisper buried deep in Soviet archives. Officially, the experiment never happened. The documents were sealed, and the engineers were told to move on. In the post-war years, the Soviet Union had far bigger triumphs to show. Rockets, supersonic jets, spaceflight. Who would care about a tank that briefly took to the sky? But history has a way of surfacing the forgotten. The discovery in the archive. In the late 1980s, a young aviation historian named Mikhail Shavrov was researching early Soviet gliders when he stumbled upon a set of old photographs, a tank with wings, strapped to a TB-3 bomber. At first he thought it was a joke or a propaganda mock-up, but the handwritten note beneath one image changed everything. Antonov A-40, tested, 1942. Pilot, S. Anokin. It was real. A secret project that had been erased from public record had actually flown, however briefly. Shavrov's research was published in a small aviation journal, and for the first time, the world learned about the A-40 Krylia tanker. Tank with wings. Soon after, engineers and aviation enthusiasts began digging deeper. Declassified documents, forgotten reports, and eyewitness accounts emerged. A full picture of Antonov's daring experiment finally came into focus. Why it was forgotten. The Soviet military, embarrassed by the impracticality of the idea, had every reason to bury the story. The A-40 had been an engineering marvel, but it was also a logistical nightmare. The TB-3 bomber couldn't handle the strain, and no replacement aircraft existed that could. The Red Army had no time for prototypes that couldn't be mass-produced. When Stalin's focus turned toward total victory, experimental designs that didn't deliver immediate results were quietly cancelled. Antonov's dream of flying armour simply didn't fit into the new reality of war, and so it vanished into classified silence. the legacy in modern design. Ironically, decades later, the world revisited the same idea, though not in the same way. In the 1950s and 60s, NATO began developing airmobile armoured units, vehicles light enough to be dropped from planes or carried by helicopters. The dream of airborne armour, fast, mobile and deployable anywhere, had returned. Antonov's crazy experiment had been ahead of its time. Even today, military engineers study the concept of modular airborne vehicles, designs that can shift between ground and air operations. While no one has tried to literally make a tank fly since 1942, Antonov's work continues to inspire boundary-pushing designs that challenge what's possible. A forgotten photo. In a museum in Kiev, there's a single surviving photograph of the A-40 glider tank during its flight test. The bomber above, the tank below, its stubby wings outstretched like a giant bird of steel. It looks surreal, almost absurd. But the photo captures something profound, a moment when imagination and courage collided in mid-air. Oleg Antonov once wrote in his notes, "Every machine begins as a dream. Some fly only once, but that once is enough." That's what the A-40 was, not a failure, but a proof of spirit. In the darkest years of the war, when most men were trying to survive, Antonov and his team dared to imagine something that had never existed before, a machine that could defy gravity and expectation alike. The wind howls softly through an empty field outside Moscow. There's no trace of wings now. No bomber above, no cables, no roaring engines, just silence. And the ghost of an idea that once flew for less than 10 minutes, yet has lived on for nearly a century. The A-40 flying tank was never meant to win battles. It was born out of desperation, imagination, and the boundless courage of engineers who refused to stop dreaming, even in the midst of war. When bombs fell and cities burned, Oleg Antonov dared to ask a question no one else would. Why can't a tank fly? It's easy to laugh at it now, to see it as one of history's strangest inventions. But every great leap forward starts as something that seems ridiculous. The same minds that were mocked for building flying tanks and rocket planes would later build space capsules and moon landers. The absurd became the extraordinary, because someone, somewhere, was willing to fail for the sake of progress. Antonov's experiment never changed the outcome of World War II, but it changed the way engineers thought about what could be done. It proved that limits are temporary, that even the most impossible dream can lift off the ground, if only for a moment. When Antonov looked back on his career years later, he never mentioned the A-40 in official interviews, but his colleagues remembered that he kept a single photograph of the flying tank in his office, faded, creased, almost forgotten, but never thrown away. Maybe that's the point. Some dreams aren't meant to last forever. They exist to remind us what's possible when we refuse to accept the word impossible. As one historian later wrote, the A-40 did not conquer the sky, but for a few moments it defied gravity, and that is enough to earn it a place in history. The flying tank may have fallen, but its story still soars,